Okay, I am now going to do my single most requested video of all time, debunking the myth that Mao starved tens of millions of people to death. It doesn't take much investigation to see a lot of these so-called works are not researched very well and are basically a load of crap. Well, the first obvious thing to point out right away is that famines are not deliberate. People don't do these on purpose. So you can already tell they're trying to make it out to be like a deliberate act of murder when clearly it was not something that was intended to happen. There is a huge culture of saying that Mao deliberately killed all these people when it clearly wasn't. The numbers are massively, wildly out of control, and I'm going to be dealing with that in the video, like debunking the actual so-called research these people keep doing. It should be obvious right away to point out, since they keep coming up with completely different numbers as to how many people were supposedly starved to death. Well, I'm going to deal with those numbers and explain how these people keep coming to these ridiculously wild numbers. But I want to deal with the fact first. It's always portrayed as though Mao did it on purpose. Well, no one causes famines on purpose. It's ridiculous. Mao wouldn't want a famine. A famine would make the Cultural Revolution look bad. It would make the Great Leap Forward look bad, so what would be the point of causing it? Besides, if these pro-capitalist authors were really so fair and honest, surely they would take the 30 million who starved to death during a famine in India while it was under British control. I mean, surely that would count as deliberate too. Or maybe the 10 million who starved to death in Bengal while the British were also ruling things there. But they're not. They're going to call those accidents. Well, I mean, if Mao does it by accident, then it's deliberate, but if the British do it, it's not. Then there's also the Irish potato famine. They're by an act that was not deliberate. It just happened. Weather and other circumstances caused 1.7 million people to die. But that many people wouldn't have had to die if the British landlords hadn't kept on insisting that the potatoes being grown be sent to England rather than feed the starving people in Ireland. Well, the British had more money, therefore they could pay more for it, therefore the market has spoken and decided that the Irish starved to death. I mean, I'm sure that they'd hold themselves up to that same standard, right? Or the 120 million people who died between 1947 and 1990 in the development of capitalist India. Completely overlooked, ignored. 120 million people died because of capitalist development. So, therefore it was deliberate, and capitalism is the greatest murderer of all time. One of the great promoters of the idea that Mao deliberately killed millions of people is from Nicholas Kristof. Here's his exact quote. Based on a decade of meticulous interviews and archival research, this magnificent biography methodically demolishes every pillar of Mao's claim to sympathy or legitimacy. Here's the thing about Nicholas Kristof and his partner Cheryl Wu Dun, who wrote a book claiming that capitalism brought equality to women in China, like just recently, which is a complete and utter lie. It's a complete slap in the face to every single Chinese person. The Cultural Revolution is what brought equality to women. Even Sansara Taylor came forward and denounced this guy for his outright lies. During the Cultural Revolution, women became recognized as persons, legally allowed to ask for divorce, legally allowed to own property, and to be able to retain custody of her own children, and basically have the same freedoms that any man would have. Now, they make this argument that because of market forces and sweatshops means women become an economic power now, when they already were under communist China, under capitalist China. They're treated horribly. The book is an outright lie. So right off the bat, we know the biggest supporters of the books are proven liars. Since we already know that these authors are complete liars, let us deal with the context during the whole event, because context is a very important thing. A lot of groups like conservatives and supporters of stateless capitalism don't seem to think context means anything, because everything exists in a little vacuum where everything works out just like in their fictional scenario. Besides, all anti-communist propaganda completely leaves out context, which I am going to give you. First, the changes that came with the agricultural system in China were absolutely necessary. There was one tiny famine after the Great Leap Forward. Before that, there was an entire history, hundreds of years of periodic famines that wiped out untold numbers. Famines were common all the time. They happened frequently. But that fact gets completely ignored. These famines ended with Mao, and the Great Leap Forward ended. These famines haven't occurred since then. This is the actual accomplishment of the Great Leap Forward, which is deliberately ignored. An important thing to note is that there were two groups running the government in China at the time. There was the Maoists and the right-wingers. There were pro-capitalists in the government, which is obvious given the way that they acted, the internal political conflict that arose from the beginning and through the whole situation of the Great Leap Forward. I mean, this is a fact that everybody knows, which is also deliberately ignored. On the right-wing side, you had Deng Xiaoping and Liu Shaoqi. On the Maoist side, you had Chairman Mao and Lin Biao. Now, these two sides conflicted constantly, and there was huge political turmoil because of this rivalry between the Maoists and the rightists. Now, even though these two were the Maoist opponents, everybody agreed that collectivization was a good idea. The rightists wanted it because it would increase food production, which was absolutely necessary. The Maoists wanted it because it would increase food, but also because it would, by the greater collectivization, would forward people's consciousness more toward the communist goal, more toward the communist line. So right off the bat, everybody wanted it. People weren't against it. There weren't these organizations of kulaks like in the Soviet Union going around and burning down crops and then blaming the loss of crops on communists. Now, it's also important to note here that it was Deng Xiaoping and Liu Shaoqi, or not specifically them, but the rightist faction who was in charge of the food program. So right off the bat, it's already Mao's fault, even though he just ordered the collectivization to happen. The people who carried out and decided how it should be done, how it should be set up, how it should be organized and implemented was all done by the right-wingers in the government. But no, Mao always gets the blame, even when it's the right-wingers who commit the errors. Now, what actually caused the failure of the food program and the Great Leap Forward? There were several factors that contributed. There were some people who resisted the collectivization, but this was very, very small. A large part of it were people lying about how much grain they were actually producing when they weren't. Now, this was done to make people look better. This is a very selfish and self-toting individualist action, which Mao even specifically warned not to do this. There was huge weather concerns that also contributed to this failure. But again, all these things deliberately ignored, although give a small mention to the fact that there was weather, but the rest of the time they'll basically ignore it and just blame everything on Mao, when there were tons of factors that contributed to it. It is important to note that during this time there was a great deal of controversy over everything happening. This split over the Great Leap Forward and the food program became a huge problem for China. Factions in the government started fighting other factions. Red Guards that were loyal to Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping started attacking ones loyal to the Maoists. The ones loyal to the Maoists started attacking the rightists. It was this whole huge incident that occurred. Now, as a result of this, they made sure that Mao got the blame. He wasn't in charge of it, but he got the blame. And as a result of this, he was forced out of the government, which means for this period afterward, he wasn't even running things. He was still the chairman of the Communist Party, but he wasn't even running the country. He was kicked out as its leader. So how is Mao this huge dictator if he wasn't even running the country? And that is a matter of fact. That is not. However, before Mao was kicked out, he was able to get one victory. He got Lin Biao set up as the leader of the People's Liberation Army, which would come to serve him again later. Now, in 1962 to 1966, Liu Shaoqi was running the Chinese government, but Mao was the leader of the Communist Party. Then Mao began the whole bombard the headquarters campaign, encouraging people to criticize the government for wrongdoings and whatnot. And eventually what happened is people started realizing what was happening, and they demanded the resignation of Liu Shaoqi. So people got together, and then the army ended up joining them, and they kicked out all the right-wingers, put Mao back in power. Now, about the actual deaths that occurred. Upon first glance, if we just go down the population column, we may think we see 15 million dead in 1960 to 1961. The Maoist International Movement warns that if Conrads had no other data or knowledge of the Great Leap, then that might be a good conclusion, and show some integrity not to second-guess it. However, in this case, Deng Xiaoping regime gave us the birth rate and the death rate data too, so now we have to ask whether those 15 million missing in 1960 and 1961 might be missing simply because there were not enough births to keep up with the deaths. Based on everything both the bourgeois media and the communists said, the Great Leap was a period of great tumult and political dedication in which we have every reason to believe that births declined. It turns out that in 1960 is the only year that Deng's data shows a loss of population caused by deaths exceeding births. That loss is 3 million people. Not 15 million, not 30 million, or 45 million, or even the 70 million by Banister, Dick Carter, or Becker later came up with. In 1960, the natural loss of population was 4.57 per thousand. Multiply that out of 650 million, and we get about 3 million more deaths than births. With the mistake of a mere 10 million people missing, there would be no natural growth rate data to report indicating a loss of life during the Great Leap, even in Deng Xiaoping's data, because most of the original famine story depended on a story of projected births, and now, ignoring internal migration, something that gets talked about later. If we look at the data for 1950 above, we will see that it is almost too perfect in the sense that it implies zero net immigration or immigration into China. So then the question arises whether the statisticians correctly counted immigration or emigration, or whether they, in some cases, inferred deaths when there were none. Do the local officials really go and check to see that someone is buried, or do they fill in interferences when there is a breakdown administratively? However, many people might be surprised to know that a lot of Maoists actually agree with Banister that if these Deng Xiaoping figures were correct, there is great merit to using the 1957 death rate and figures to figure out how many deaths that occurred from combined natural disasters and policy disasters. If there were no emigration out of China, then we would need to explain the deaths of 15 million people over these after the years 1957 on, just as Banister says in her lower end estimate of the dead. The one we find reasonable given what she knows. If the 10 million are from a breakdown in the statistical agency, then given that Liu Shaoqi admitted that 30% were from natural disasters, Mao would be left with almost zero blame. On the other hand, we could also ask how likely it was that 15 million deaths spread out over 4 years would be something that any other alternative leader could have avoided if they avoided some deaths. Would some of their policies have created even more deaths in other categories? The Maoist International Movement would say so, particularly in the Liu Shaoqi line of healthcare and agriculture. So in conclusion, what I would like to say is that the famine deaths were wildly blown out of proportion. No context is given, no explanation as to how the deaths supposedly came about. It was completely missing a lot of facts, completely twisting numbers to make them say whatever you want to. I mean, that's the history of capitalism. So I'd just like to say that most of these books are a complete outright lie. Another important piece of history that's also deliberately overlooked is that from 1968 to 1971, there was this period called the Flying Leap Forward. This was the second attempt at the Great Leap Forward. This time it was done more quickly, and it was done from a completely Maoist perspective. Much of the criticism that came upon the Great Leap Forward was that it did not properly follow a Maoist line. Now, when completely Maoists had control of it and followed a Maoist line, it went off without a hitch. So I'm personally of the opinion, had it followed a properly Maoist line the first time, it wouldn't have been as bad. I still think weather and people's reaction was a major contributing factor. It still would have happened. It wouldn't have been anywhere near as bad. But when it was done from a pure Maoist principle, it went off without a hitch. This is a scholarly work. I have tons of sources and even further information if you want to see it. All of it in the description. It'll link back to the text version of this document that actually contains more information and links leading to even more information. This is how you deal with a subject. This is how it's supposed to be done. Not just simply reciting a few facts verbatim off of a Guardian article on a book. This is called analysis. It's not just simply repeating something from an online Guardian article and just standing there reciting this verbatim like a cultist and pretending you know how the world works. This is the real deal.